Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for coming to this month's panel on democracy and vulnerability. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Allison Lee, the managing director at PEN America in Los Angeles. Throughout her career, Allison has spent 3 decades in the nonprofit center, organizing and advocating for her community. Before coming to PEN America, she served as executive director of American Jewish World Service and vice president of external affairs at Bet Tzedek Legal Services. Additionally, she worked at Time's Up as chief development officer to support gender equity and combat sexual violence. And earlier this month, Allison spoke on CBS News about the recent book censorship rules in libraries in Huntington Beach and has continuously been an advocate for literary free speech in the United States. We'd like to further express our gratitude to Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for their kind support of both the online and on-site discussion series at the Wende. Today's session features a 1-hour conversation with Allison, moderated by student council member Emma Larson. Questions during the discussion will be posed by council members Zora Nelson, Matthew Jones, Emma, and myself. Following the event, a blog post authored by Zora will be shared. Allison, it's a pleasure to engage and have this conversation with you. And now I'm going to hand things over to, to the moderator.
Hi, everyone. Allison, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. It's truly an honor to get an opportunity to pose some questions to you about free speech and democracy and vulnerability and kind of all of these questions that are really defining our newsreels and our lives each and every day. Also told us a little bit about your professional life prior to joining PEN America, and I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about your shift to join PEN America Los Angeles?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be with you all today and to be in conversation. As my bio kind of suggests, I've worked in the nonprofit space my entire professional career, which now is just over 3 decades, which is a little hard to kind of take, but I'll take it. And always in progressive social justice spaces. But I've worked kind of like all over the map. I've worked with gender equity organizations, promoting gender equity, ending workplace sexual harassment, but also on global human rights issues, but also really down to very local direct service organizations like legal services, to then issues that we work at here at PEN America on literary issues and free expression issues. All of it really guided by a deep desire to be engaged in work that I found meaningful, but also work that I felt could impact social change. So I don't know exactly how I got there, other than the fact that when I was an undergrad, I was an activist and an advocate, and I was looking for ways in which I could professionalize that. I was looking for ways in which I could kind of take that into, I didn't want to give that up. And I realized that I could go into the nonprofit sector and I could continue that journey and impact change. And so, I've been really grateful to have a career that has really allowed me to touch on multiple issues, but all of which that I feel like kind of really has this through line of, promoting human rights.
That's so inspiring to hear that a goal that you had 30 plus years ago is still kind of the driving force of your life. I think Matt has a question a little bit more specifically about PEN America and just about your journey with advocacy.
Yeah, so first off, really lovely to have you here and excited to have this conversation. As you said, you've been in the advocacy or social justice sector for quite a while now, but what is something that perhaps has surprised you about the process of advocacy more recently in the last 5 or 10 years? Do you feel things shifting? And, how has your time at PEN America sort of challenged you and grown you?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because when I started at PEN America, I was kind of like, well, it's the first time I've ever worked for an organization that was what would be, part of PEN America is like kind of like this two sides of PEN America. It's this like literary and cultural organization, and then it's this advocacy organization. And I came in and I was like, okay, I get the advocacy side, but I'm not really sure how much I'll understand or how much learning I'll have to do around the literary side. And I think what I quickly realized that like it was like my inner book geek was actually quite strong. Like I was like, okay, you need to admit to yourself that you were that kid who really grew up in their local public library. Like I was a kid who really found themselves. I grew up in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. I didn't quite fit in anywhere, but I always found myself in a book. I had a grandparent who is an immigrant to this country who taught me that more so than their driver's license, more so than their passport, he was a pharmacist, so that was how he earned a living, more so than that professional license, that the most important document he ever got was his library card, because that's how he learned how to travel. Like that's what opened more doors for him. And so actually, I think like in a weird sort of way, I was like, when the biggest area of growth was actually a return to myself. Like, if that makes any sense, like it was this return to like this recognition of discovery of what a book and what a story can mean to a person and how important those stories are. And when you think about the advocacy work that PEN America is doing to ensure that free expression, that creative expression happens, right? Like that we are not banning books, that we are allowing, that we are stopping educational censorship. Like that is the root of it. Like those two worlds connecting for me was like this kind of very, it was beautiful. Like it was a return to myself. That's all I can say. So that was kind of a beautiful, unexpected gift that PEN gave to me.
As definitely someone who was and still is a book geek, and like that has, taken different renditions throughout my life, and I'm sure will continue. I appreciate that has been something you have rediscovered. I know Zora has a question that kind of speaks to the bridging of PEN America's interest in literacy work and advocacy work, and also maybe adds a creative lens to it as well.
Yes, thank you, Emma, and thank you for joining us, Allison. I wanted to say, as a creative writer myself, who is interested in incorporating a social justice angle, what are your thoughts on the role of more creative pieces of literature or writing in our culture, be it poetry, prose, fiction, novels, etc.? And do you think that forms like poetry specifically may serve as even more of a threat in a way to those in charge due to its inherent non-conforming nature?
Well, I think what I have come to appreciate, well, like, so first of all, I often get asked like if I have a writing practice. Many people who work at PEN America have a writing practice. I am not one of them. I think I like dabbled. When I dabbled in writing, just so you know, I dabbled in poetry. As an undergrad, I think I realized I was not very good at it. I thought I was good at it, but I wasn't very good at it. But I think what I've come to appreciate is like the restless soul nature of poets. And I don't know if it's just because of like what you're saying. It's like the concise nature of the genre, right? Like you don't have a full page, you don't have a chapter, it's not even short form, right? Like you have a very short amount of time to get it out, like to get the point across. And so there's an urgency to it, and that urgency like it goes well with action, right? That urgency goes well with like stirring the soul into action and advocacy. And so I don't think it's surprising that like those two things can sometimes go hand in hand. If you think about kind of the earliest poets, like if you like go back even to like the oral tradition, if you go back to the Bible and the prophets, like that's original poetry, right? And they were the ones who were saying, wake up, people, pay attention, like this is a thing I have to tell you. And so I do think that that is in many ways the role of the poet, and what we have seen poets do for us, what we see often in protest movements happening. I know for me, there are many poems and there are many poets that I turn to that can move me to a place of both, thoughtfulness, but also so what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, I mean, my academic specialty is on like the Soviet and post-Soviet space, and just thinking there are like so many good examples. And I think now with like an autocratic Russian state kind of pushing down on freedom of speech, they're doing that because words have power, and like the poetry that people write about their experiences can be really mobilized. With that in mind, Elsa has a question about some of the ways that PEN America is trying to help protect those writers.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Yeah, exactly. I know that PEN America has done a lot to protect writers and literature in the US. And I was wondering, is there anything that these American literary institutions can do to protect marginalized or politically targeted writers abroad as well?
Yeah. So PEN America is one of many PEN centers. PEN America is just one of many PEN centers around the world. There are PEN centers around the world, all in many different countries. There's a PEN International, and then there are many PEN centers around the world. And we just happen to be PEN America. We happen to be the one, located here. PEN America runs our a Freedom to Write center, and that Freedom to Write center each year puts out an index, our Freedom to Write index, that highlights issues of writers that are imprisoned or jailed around the world or at risk around the world. Our next Freedom to Write index will be published. It's published each spring. And each year we also highlight, each year at we highlight a writer at risk. Last year, the writer at risk that we highlighted, Nargis Mohammadi, she went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. She just had a birthday in jail. Like, she just celebrated a birthday in jail in Iran. And so, one of the things that we hope to do is use, the literal power of the pen to, put the spotlight on those countries that are imprisoning writers, that are putting writers at risk, for telling the stories of what is happening in their countries, and to not allow that spotlight to, because they might be imprisoned, to go away. And so, we're in a case like Nargis, that is the best possible scenario by which we could add our voice to it. And then obviously, for it to get the recognition of the Nobel Prize was just an incredible moment for us. But we are just one of many voices around the world, one of many PEN centers, to do that work.
That's a powerful example of kind of like bringing a spotlight to a writer and then them being recognized in a really big way on an international stage. I am curious though, have you ever, or in devil's advocate moment, is there an argument to be made that it's potentially harmful to be highlighting these writers, like drawing more attention to them might produce backlash from the state that they live in?
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for our staff who do that work, and I and I'm not going to say anything more. I think that they make a determination of when it is best to highlight a writer and when it is best to perhaps not to, or not to, but like, you know, when it is best to when pressure, what is the best pressure campaign? Like, how is it best? Like, where, you know, I think sometimes, you know, different organizations get criticized at different points about, you know, why am I not seeing something more public? And I think it's important to always know when you're dealing with organizations that are doing work internationally, that sometimes you're going to see something publicly and sometimes you're not going to see the work publicly. And this comes from also the work that I've done previously, not at Penn, but at other organizations, that there is always something that is happening when you're working with artists at risk, when you're working with writers at risk, that there's always going to be very public work and there's always going to be very behind the scenes work. And then I trust our team, I trust our staff to know how best to do that work and when best it is to put the spotlight on and when best it is better to do the work quietly.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a lovely answer. And just that, like, there's also an undercurrent of Pen America. My, like, I'm familiar with Pen America.
Like, I'm sure in your work and in your studies, like in what you're in, you know, like in your studies, I'm sure you know that, right? Like there's different types of advocacy that works. And sometimes it's the very frontal advocacy. And sometimes that is exactly what doesn't work in a particular system and in a particular country.
Yeah, I think that like all, you know, not all, but the majority of like social advocacy organizations, it's always so amazing to me that they're coming at the issues from so many different angles. We're talking to Pen America, so to turn it back to an American context, I'm going to give the floor over to Matt.
Perfect. So a lot of your more recent visible advocacy work has been done in, say, Florida or Texas, focusing on these book bans that have been, you know, legislated at the highest level in those contexts. And even, you know, in Huntington Beach, which is kind of a notorious conservative bastion in an otherwise liberal area. But I was just curious, kind of for those of us that spend most of our time in sort of these liberal bubbles, there are obviously still major threats to both literacy and to free speech and to kind of a lot of the same, you know, rights that you're protecting in these other contexts. So just curious, what are some of the current threats or challenges that are facing us in liberal areas that we might not be as aware of and that we should be more attuned to?
Sure. So just last week, Pen America published its most recent school index of school book bans that outlined the number of book bans that happened in the first half of the 2023-2024 school year. So that would be from, you know, just from the beginning of the school year until like December 31st, 2023. And the numbers are really staggering in that it was over 4,000 book bans throughout the country in the first half of the year, which is more than the entire school year the year before. So, you know, we're kind of seeing a supercharge in the number of book bans that are happening. Pen America started, you know, this is about 3 years into this, to us tracking book bans. And what we're seeing now and what is different is both, you know, is the role that state legislation is now playing in supercharging the bans. So, you know, in states like Texas and states like Florida, which account for 40% of all book bans in the country, in states like Iowa and Missouri and Utah, you now have state legislation. So you're not talking about book bans in this district or that district. You're now talking about book bans that are impacting the entire state, and book bans that are so, you know, the legislation is so sweeping, it can cover so much material that teachers and librarians are like, there's so many types of books that could get swept up because the legislation is so vague that, you know, in some parts of Florida, you're talking about like the dictionary was pulled, like the Guinness Book of World Records was pulled. I mean, you're talking about just like, it's like, well, I mean, based on your legislation, like these words are, they're a little dicey, so we're going to have to pull them. And so it's in the dictionary, so we're going to have to pull it, right? And so, that's kind of like the where we are in this time of book banning. But lest we think that this is just a problem of very red states, or that this isn't an issue that we should all be concerned about. It's like, oh, I live in California, or I live in New York, or I'm cool, I don't, that's why I live on the coastal whatever. This is a hyper local issue. Even if you live in a state that is not passing statewide legislation on book bans, there's two things to consider, especially for this group to consider. And this is part of a national movement, the Ed Scare national movement, that is really intentionally fomenting fear of our basic institutions, public education, public libraries. And we can explore that a little bit a little bit more as we continue the conversation. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean for education? What does that mean for critical thinking? All of that. But it is also a hyper local issue that is often determined by local school boards, city councils. We've seen that in Huntington Beach here in California. We can see that in Temecula and in Fresno and different parts of California. And oftentimes people aren't paying attention to those local elections, and they're not looking at who's running, and they oftentimes aren't even really going out to vote. And so, that has the power to really, then those school boards turn over, and the people who are paying attention are the people who are leading this book ban movement, and they're very intentionally seating those city councils and those school boards. And so, you really do have to be vigilant and aware. And just one more thing, like, let's be very clear about, and the data and the reporting that PEN America has done is very clear. Like, this is not a random book here or there. Book bans target very specifically books by or about LGBTQ characters, books by or about people of color or about race or racism, books that center sexual violence, consent, or for young adult, like women, a coming of age story, and books that deal, young adult books that deal with mental health, depression, that sort of thing. There's a very intentional narrative that is being suppressed here. There's a very intentional narrative. For young adult books, that's a very intentional narrative that is being suppressed. There's a very intentional set of ideas, therefore, that is being trying to put forward. And then what's being caught up in that can be picture books of, like, like, I don't know if everybody knows that there's a picture book called In Tango Makes Three, which is like a picture book, a real story of two male penguins from the Central Park Zoo who raised, who raised a chick together. And that book has been banned. So, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, the idea that it's not just a problem for people that are not like us, like, I think there is this, like, well, I live in LA, and so I don't have to worry about this. But, like, organizations like PEN America are building a better world for everyone. And then B, like, the local is the national, which is the global, and, like, it all is really interconnected. I know book bans definitely get a lot of press. And so Zora has a question that kind of takes us beyond just book bans to think a little bit more broadly about free speech today.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, so I want to hearken on last year's theme, the political mandate of the arts. And aside from book banning, with that, I want to ask, what do you think are the most threatening ways that writing is mandated, regulated, or politicized today?
Yeah. You have such good themes. You know, I think the idea, like, I actually think the idea of like free expression and the First Amendment is actually, I think it's like actually a really difficult idea. Like, it's actually a really hard thing if you think about the world we live in today, right? Like the idea of the First Amendment is that I'm here to protect not the speech I agree with. I'm here really ultimately to protect the speech of the person that I disagree with, right? I'm here to protect the speech, not necessarily just my speech, but the speech that I really don't agree with. And yet, for the most part, because, and I'm going to pick up my phone, like, because of phones, because of social media, because of the algorithms, we generally are protected from encountering much speech that we disagree with, especially young people. I'm gonna for the most part, like, depending on where you get your news sources, but even everybody, right? Like, I mean, think about like people, like, you watch exactly the news that you want to watch. And when you watch that, I ask people all the time, like, when's the last time you watched or listened or read a news story that you didn't already agree with? Like, when's the last time you saw something, and then pause and remember that somebody somewhere else is reading an account of that story that's entirely different than your account, and they entirely agree with their account. And we never actually see the other account, and we never actually are challenged to think about the other point of view. And there is this, like, like, we've been taught, like, depends what facts are or alternative facts. And because of mis and disinformation, and because there's very little fact checking going on social media, people just keep saying the same thing over and over again as fact, and then everybody says it's fact. And so it's I mean, Zora, I don't know if this is like this very convoluted answer to your question, but I think like I don't know if this is just writing that's regulated and mandated and politicized, but I think it's like the whole enterprise is like, it's the way we're consuming not just our writing, but we're consuming information, and the way in which we are potentially not interrogating that, like, where we really aren't that comfortable anymore interrogating difference. Like, we're not that comfortable, and we don't really want to be that comfortable sitting with someone, I don't really want to listen to somebody I really disagree with anymore. And if I don't really even want to listen to somebody who I disagree with anymore, do I really want to protect their speech? So that's, to me, the most challenging part of, like, where you get to the first, to some of the First Amendment challenges that free and creative expression kind of come out of.
Yeah, protecting other people's the opinions you don't agree with are like the ones that need to be there because you don't agree with them, so you can learn from them.
Right.
And I think that brings is tangential to a really big conversation when we're talking about free speech that I think is particularly relevant in this moment. So I'm going to hand it over to Elsa to dive into that.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. My question is about, I guess, free speech and hate speech. And if you encounter these in your work, these tensions between free speech and hate speech, and how we can navigate that sort of tension between upholding the principles of free speech, but also avoiding potential harmful or discriminatory content.
Yeah. We certainly get this quite a bit. I mean, I think we're seeing this quite a bit, particularly in our work on college campuses. You know, we do a lot of campus work, campus free speech work, higher ed work. And I think that there is this, you know, there is this thing of like, how do we engage in peaceful protest at the same time of, you know, safeguarding that right to protest while at the same time, you know, protecting people against hate speech, anti-Semitic speech, Islamophobic speech, ensuring that a campus is safe and open to all, and how do you balance the responsibilities of that? Who decides? You know, there are like legal definitions of what is hate speech. There are legal definitions of that, and also, you know, like, how do you create an environment? How do you also then create and ensure an environment of that dialogue that we just talked about as well? So I think that is one of the hardest things that we are all encountering right now. And I think that it is, I don't, you know, I would say, you know, if you were to go, I would encourage people to go to our website. We have a guide for campus free speech. We put out a statement today, in particular about the current, and I can, if I'm skillful enough, I can try and put it in the, if I put it in the chat, will everybody see it? Maybe, or maybe just I'll put it in the chat and you all can put it there. And in that statement, it has like protests on campus and tips for how you can communicate and how do you handle, you know, a rise in hate speech and that sort of thing. I would encourage everyone to go there and to think about it, to engage in it. I encourage people to be thoughtful about their own speech, but also, you know, I would think about standing for the principle of free speech really means considering, like, you know, interrogating you know, where do we stand for the principle, and can it hold up? Can the principle hold up ideologically? Like, could I hold this up if I was hitting, if I was getting ideologically, regardless of where it was coming from, if it was coming from the ideological left or the ideological right? That kind of, you know, whatever I was hearing. And so I would encourage people to read it with that in mind, but certainly to look at our resources.
Yeah, I'll say that, like, as a student at Columbia right now, I read the guide on campus protests and thought it was really well done and spoke to a lot of kind of my emotions as I am waiting through that.
I feel like I should be learning from you all, because I've got NYU, Columbia, UCLA. Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. I feel like you all are probably more the experts. I'm sitting in an office and you all are on college campuses. So right now I feel like we could be learning from you. Yeah.
Does anyone have any reflections?
Yeah.
I was just going to say the idea of the echo chamber like resonates with me a lot, because I mean, UCLA is a huge public university with a pretty, I mean, it could be better, but a pretty diverse range of you know, backgrounds, classes, etc. But a lot of times in like my humanities or social sciences class, it's a continuously like validating experience, learning experience of your own academic opinions and political opinions. So, and then when you are then confronted with somebody who might not agree with you, it feels like an attack, like it feels like a personal attack, which is, I think, why people have become so hostile to accepting different perspectives and challenging their own opinions.
Yeah, I want to say, like, I feel like this, especially being a challenge on college campuses, is very real, especially like given like events in New York this week. I mean, I know like there's been a lot of protests at Columbia and like NYU, including one at NYU that was part of Monday. There were some false accusations about like hate speech, and I feel like, I don't know, it's kind of challenging kind of navigating that with these like really institutions who like very much so like try to have this like unity front, but sometimes seem like that's not actually the case. So yeah, I'd say it really is challenging because things do, especially now, I feel like get really lost in translation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's just it then becomes hard to like what is hate speech, because what one person might feel is hateful, another person might not. And so that can be, such a tough moment to wade through. And I totally agree with Zora that the media in producing more words has really taken up specific examples and kind of painted a picture that is not necessarily the reality of like a lot of students. And so that's another interesting way of like, there's the power of the creative written word, there's the power of words in protest, and there's like the power of the word of the media. And when they all get thrown together on an issue that's contentious, it can be really, really hard to, figure out what is the line for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. In the spirit of trying to think about not just using avenues like PEN America to protect words, but also maybe create new words, I know that Zora has a question about what is the responsibility of writers in unstable political times.
Yes, I do. I wanted to ask, do you think that artists, just in general, but specifically writers, hold a responsibility to condemn injustice, even in a polarizing climate? Or do you think they rather should hold more of a goal towards uniting, as I just mentioned, that I feel like some like academic institutions try to like go more towards? And further, did this consideration play a role in the controversy about PEN America allegedly being indecisive in the condemnation of the events in Gaza?
Yeah. So I think there's two different things. I think it's the role of the writer as opposed to the role of PEN America as an organization for all writers. So, but I think PEN America believes that by all means, writers have always been and should always use their voices and their writing to speak out and to be a voice of, to use their conscience. And wherever that lands them, however that lands them, and to be advocates or to choose to not be, right? Like, however, whatever that means to them in the moment, and if that means to, and that could mean very different things to very different people. PEN America as an organization has always seen itself as a big tent organization. We are here, we have been around for 101 years, and we see ourselves as an organization. We as an organization are here for all of the writers, right? So many writers are going to see any particular conflict or any particular situation in lots of different ways. We want them all to be able to express themselves. We stand for the ability, for the rights of everyone to have free expression, to be able to freely express themselves, for those rights to be protected. And we ourselves want to be able to create that tent so that all writers can do that. So we're not calling for unification for one voice. We're allowing for the multitude of voices to exist and to be protected and to be heard. But we respect all writers to follow their consciences. And if that includes, by the way, protesting PEN America, we respect that as well.
That's a beautiful answer, and I think speaks to also, just to draw back to talking about like the speech that we need to protect is sometimes the speech that we don't necessarily agree with. It's about increasing voices often. And so yeah, thank you for that. talking about the written word, I'm curious, what's a recent text that's nonfiction or fiction or poetry or any text that you've written, that you read recently, that has given you some power in these troubling times?
So I think I gave you, I don't know if you have it, I think I gave you in advance 2 poems. I gave you a poem written by an Israeli a while ago. I think it was written by an Israeli author, writer, Yehuda Amichai, that's called The Diameter of the Bomb. And then there is a poem that was written by a Palestinian writer in Gaza. And I do not speak Arabic, so I'm probably going to say his name incorrectly, but I think it's Refaat Al-Rir. And he was killed in Gaza this year. And his poem is If I Must Die. And if someone can put both links in the chat, that would be great. I would appreciate that. Zora, you had asked earlier about the power of poetry. I hold both of these poems. I hold both of these poems with me because, I think that they remind me that in all of the talking that we're hearing, who talked about all the words that we're hearing in the media and all of it, that the humanity, the human cost is real and intimate, and you cannot ever take away that the intimacy of a single human life. And these 2 poets, in their own way, are telling us that on either side of this particular conflict, these are not contemporaries, which I also find interesting, and they just speak to me.
Yeah, I think being a graduate student, I spend a lot of my days reading and writing and engaging with text. And it can be so powerful when there is a text that reminds you of things that exist outside of text, if that makes sense. It brings you back to the reality of oh, we live in a world where real things happen, and the words that I write and the words that I read can have a real effect on people. And I read the poems you sent and appreciated that aspect of them. Also has a question, kind of taking us beyond just the power of the written word to think about other kinds of protests and lobbying.
Right. So I was wondering, to you, what distinguishes writing from other forms of activism, such as protesting or lobbying in influencing public opinion and policy, and how, if they do these forms of activism intersect?
Yeah. I was thinking about that question, and I was thinking about the fact that Toni Morrison's Beloved is still getting banned, right? And I was thinking about when it was written and the context of when it was written in the story that it tells, right? And forget the fact that it's still getting banned, but I was thinking about when I read it, how young I was when I read it and what it changed for me. And then the fact that people are still reading it now. And I was thinking about that power of a story, right? And so it's here it is, stories remain, even take these 2 poems, Yehuda Amichai's poem was written a while ago, right? And yet it's relevant now. And so this idea of words, stories, poems can be written in a particular time and they remain. And advocacy is so like current. It is in the moment. It is responding to an issue. It is responding to a bill. It is responding to, you know, it's trying to influence an election. It is trying to influence an outcome. And yet a story is what inspires us. A book is what inspires us. It is what stays with us. It's what informs us. We can read it once when we're 18 and read it again when we're in our 20s, and we can read it again when we're in our 30s and in our 50s, and we can have an entirely different reading of it. And the author can no longer be with us, and yet they can still be teaching us something, right? And so, and it can inform our activism in all those different stages of our lives. And so, you know, I don't know. I just kind of think about, you know, I kind of think of the staying power of that.
Yeah. And then taking us back to writing, Zora has a word very specifically that I think gets to, sorry, Zora has a, I think I said Zora has a word. Zora has a question that gets to some very specifics about.
Question that has words in it. It's fine.
Yes, a question that has words in it about other things that have words in them.
Thank you for your words, Emma. And I wanted to know, historically and in present times, how can a pen most powerfully facilitate a protest in a weakened democracy?
I mean, when I think about that, so when I talk to people about PEN America, I often like do this little thing where I talk about the fact that PEN America was founded 101 years ago. If you think about 1922, when PEN America was founded, like I take people back to 1922 when PEN America was founded, because oftentimes when I'm talking to people, I'm in somebody's like living room or something like that. And I'll go like, PEN America was founded in a living room, not so dissimilar to this, by people who were coming together, and they were kind of, you know, and it was some writers, and it was some people who liked writers. And sometimes, because it depends on the kind of urban legend that you hear about PEN, because sometimes some people say, well, it was founded by a bunch of people who wanted to make sure that they could bail writers out of jail because the writers were like going to jail because they were protesting things or whatever. But a lot of times what it was like people who were coming together because they saw a rise in authoritarianism and what was going on, and they were like, oh, we're writers, we should be coming together to say something about this. And then, you know, so that was 1922. PEN America specifically is guided by our charter, which I can share with everyone. It was from 1948. And so you think about what the world was like in 1948, and you think about McCarthyism, and you think about all of that. And then you're kind of thinking about, okay, where we are now, and what I told you about book banning and this kind of movement that we are in to kind of sow distrust and the things like think of there is nothing more basic than public school and libraries, right? Like it is the thing that binds us together. Like when we talk about like why we can't listen to each other or speak kindly to each other, it's because like we are in these camps. Why we are so polarized from each other is because we're now being taught that like teachers and librarians are the ones that we shouldn't be trusting, right? And so you know, when you think about that, like historically, like there are cycles. We appear to be in a cycle. And so this is when we need the words. This is when we need the writers. This is why they are trying to suppress these stories. It is not entirely shocking that just when an entire canon of literature by people of color and LGBTQ people and women started really coming out and and like was gaining popularity, and there was suddenly this explosion of literature in which children and young adults could like see families that were different and stories that were different, that there was this reaction to like push against it, right? So that's what we're seeing. And it's this, it feels both very historical and very present in the moment. And that is what the pen has always fought against.
That reminds me so much of one of my favorite poets, Denise Levertov, who was protesting the Vietnam War back in her day, and she was facing all this backlash from fellow poets who were saying, "Why are you getting involved? Like, you should be, just writing." And she wrote that you claim to love the world, and yet if you don't then try to save it, if you don't act, out and try to actually do something, then not only does that render your words about loving the world empty, you also will soon not have a world to say your words in. And just like that really fine line of like dedicated to your craft, but because you're dedicated to your craft, you join in these broader movements. It's really meaningful.
I love that.
And Matt, I know you have a great question to kind of think about the world that we are interested in saving.
Yeah, just as a final question, what are sources of joy and beauty in your life, aside from reading, aside from sort of your literary advocacy work, sources of joy and beauty that help sustain your activism, and your well-being, and kind of, help you live in this world that you want to continue to preserve?
Well, I thank you for the question, because I feel like the question itself is a reminder to make sure that I'm finding the joy and the beauty. Because I actually think that that those of us who are like engaged in these struggles and engaged in the work and engaged in this kind of like serious interrogation of the work, like let's admit it, like it's rough out there. And it is it is easy to kind of resort to feeling overwhelmed, right? Like it is, and I will be the first to admit that like it is very easy to give in to that kind of feeling of like let's just like like I don't know where the beauty is. Is it like too mundane to say like I really like love walking my dog? I really love walking my dog. My dog takes so much joy out of his walks that like I watch him walk and he has joy in his walk that it gives me joy. It's very simple. Like it's so simple. His life is simple. The simplicity of his life reminds me of that simplicity. But I will go a little bit higher than that just to end on. But I recently had the opportunity to travel. I love to travel. And I recently had the opportunity, I just got back a couple weeks ago from a trip to Morocco. So I really like to travel anywhere, but international travel. And I was reminded in that traveling both how large and small the world is, and how important it is to really get very far outside of yourself as often as you possibly can, to be reminded about how large and small the world is, and how both different we all are from each other, and yet at our very core, without being Pollyannish or anything. I'm not being reductionist, but I am like, when you really do try to meet people at our basic, like when you really just do try to encounter humanity, and learn with a curious spirit about other people, there is a joy and a beauty to that connective tissue that I think is so important. And there's so much pressure on us telling us that that is not true, and that is not real. And it is so easy to believe that when you can like really get out there and just like get that out, like swipe it out, like literally swipe it out, that brings that is a really important reminder of joy and beauty.
Well, I think what I hear from you, right, is in each of those cases, both when you're just walking your dog and when you're engaging in maybe slightly more, ambitious modes of recreation. Each of those, though, is you pushing back against being alienated from both just the world that's right around you and from the people that inhabit that world. I think that's something that's so important about a sustaining understanding of the beauty that's in the world, is preventing that fundamental alienation from both like your surroundings and the people there with you that share it. I really like that. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for asking and reminding me that there is joy and beauty.
And also the written word is a really fantastic place to find some of that joy and beauty. So thank you to all the work that Pet America does so that all of us may enjoy more of that writing and more of those words. Thank you, Allison, so much for this wonderful conversation. Thank you to all of our viewers. I encourage everyone to register for next month's talk, which will take place on May 29th at 4 p.m. Pacific time with photographer and activist Catherine Opie. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a safe and restful evening.
Thank you.